Okay, right. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Phil. For those who are joining the recording or just coming in now, as Phil has just said, it's the second of Working People of Faith's Faith in Action interviews, where we speak to people of different faith backgrounds and learn more about them and how their faith affects their life and work. It's my equally great pleasure to welcome our guest this evening, Her Worship, the Mayor of Woking, Cllr Beryl Hunwicks. Beryl, don't worry, I will not be saying all that mouthful every time I speak to you. Beryl, I'm afraid, is going to have to do, or we'll be here all evening. I was just thinking back. I think you and I have known each other about 10 years or so. Yep. Probably since I started in with Working People of Faith when you were a trustee at the time. I think what we'll do first, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you, but can you say something for our audience of listeners and watchers, say something about your background and how you ultimately got to be mayor?
Okay. Okay.
That's a big job.
Yeah. So I was born in Southeast London. Very, very earliest years were there, and we moved out then to what was then Northwest Kent, which later became the London Borough of Bromley. So basically in the south of London. I went to school in London right through to, I was in Camberwell at secondary school. And then when I left school, I did a theology degree in London and followed it, but my 1 year away from somewhere north of Watford. So I went, in fact, to Nottingham for a year and did my PGCE there, and then moved back to Watford as it happened and became head of RE there. And I was there until we moved in 1971 down to Woking. So that's basically it. I met Alan whilst I was in Watford. We got married in 1970. And then in the early years here, Woking, we had 2 girls. How did I get to being mayor? Quite, and this will come out later, but I'll just keep it just sketchy at the moment. In 2006, I was invited by somebody who was already then a Woking Borough Councillor to a church event over in Bracknell. And it was over there, and they had a series of speakers who just said, you know, God wants people in all sorts of different places. And there was an emphasis then on getting involved in public life. At that point, I'd been teaching all my adult life. I'd taught at 2 schools in Woking, 1 in Guildford, and I'd just taken early retirement from the school in 2003, really not knowing what the future held, certainly nothing to do with being a councillor. But anyway, to just again cut it really short, I became a councillor in 2007, and again I want to come back to that later. But for the last 14 years, I've been a councillor. Twice I was asked to become mayor. What happens is it's almost a rite of passage. So depending on the groupings at council, it's the people who've longest served in that group, and then we alternate with another party, and again the same thing happens. So I twice been asked before, but I'd consulted with Alan and we just didn't feel it was the right time. I felt I had things that I wanted to finish in terms of what I was responsible for. And so we left it until I became deputy mayor in May 2018. So that's basically it. And then you become deputy, then mayor. So that's how it works.
That's in about 4 minutes. You've just done a whole lifetime. That's amazing.
There's a lot that I want to go back to, because, but I just thought I'd just give the sketch.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's very helpful. It gives us a very good overview. So, can you tell us a little bit about your actual faith itself? Right. And in your terms of your faith, was there some sort of epiphany, or was it something that grew gradually through your family, or what happened for you?
Okay, and this is if you like, this is not just the thread, but this is the mainstay of everything else I'm going to say tonight. So, unlike some faiths, you're not born a Christian. You're not born into a Christian country or born into a Christian family. Well, you can be born into a Christian family, but there comes a time when you have to make your own decision about whether you're going to truly follow that faith. So for me, funnily enough, I always say it wasn't a dramatic testimony. It wasn't a dramatic story, no wild living. I was only 8 at the time, but it was as clear as if it had happened yesterday. And I can remember hearing a story of Jesus going to a village. It was simply told, and incidentally, there were thousands of people there. So it was an amazing, and I can still remember those particular meetings, but it was in London. And the story was of Jesus going to a village. So it was one of the gospel stories. And during the talk, the person who was speaking said that actually at that village, very few people wanted to hear what Jesus was saying, and actually basically threw him out of the village. And from there was the question to us, so what do you want to do with Jesus? Do you just want to just hear about him in a story, or do you want to have him take your life and use it? And in a very simple way that night, and the best picture I can use is it was like a contract was sealed. God promised to lead me, never leave me, never forsake me, and he would be with me in every twist and turn of the road of my life. And I, in return, promised to trust him, to listen to him, and to let him take, now I'm using a picture here, the steering wheel. And I was only 8, but it was as clear. It was in April that year, and I felt that the seal had been settled. So fast forward 15 years, and I learned that God had directed the road ahead through school, through university. My first job, as I said, was in Watford, and also getting married. And God was good. He'd certainly kept his side of the bargain. Everything was fine. He'd answered countless prayers. And I was learning more about him and listening to his voice. This was pretty, in my view, this was okay. But I wanted to ask a question, really, and this is, again, something that I've learned a lot since. What about, and I'll call it this, when the and suddenlies of life happen? You know, when something comes out of the blue and you think, golly, where did that come from? Well, out of the blue, I was hit by, literally actually on one occasion, by broadside events that were to shake me to the core. He'd got it clearly shown, Alan and me, that we were to move to Woking. It wasn't just a chance area. He knew it very well because he'd been born here. But I didn't know Woking. I'd heard of it, of course, but I didn't know anything about it. And we were thrilled about owning our own house. And after a day of decorating, it was in November 1971, we decided to head out to the cinema in Esher. And it was a very cold, wet night. Well, just to say that we never made it, because whilst we were crossing the road of the main Esher High Street to the then cinema, in fact, I think it's still there actually, we were mown down by a car. If I can say that we weren't trying to run across the road and play chicken, we were actually on a pedestrian crossing that was governed by lights. And in fact, the cars were at red. And this poor, I felt sorry for her afterwards, but this poor person, I don't know what she was doing, but she just continued to go through the crossing and we happened to be on it. So we landed up in hospital, rather the worse for wear. But there were no long-term damages. And by the end of January, we were up and running again. 18 months later, we had, by that time, a little girl of 11 months. So this is August 1973. Again, it's the and suddenlies of life that completely, throw you off the rail, really. And again, I can remember having had, it was a bank holiday Monday, and as I say, we had an 11-month-old baby by then, but I began not to feel very well. And 24 hours later, we'd called the doctor. I thought I had, in fact, I said to my husband, I said, I think I've got chicken pox. Now, I'd had chicken pox, but that's what I thought I had. But the doctor took one look at me, and I was rushed to St. Peter's by ambulance and put into isolation. Meningitis was diagnosed, and for the next 10 days, my life hung in the balance. Now, if I was to say to you, and I still can't remember bits of it, but not much, because most of that time I was unconscious. I had no idea what was happening around me, except I had an absolutely sort of distraught husband. My mum was looking after my daughter. They didn't know one end of the day. They didn't know what to expect. And you suddenly then become, I was only, 26, and you suddenly become aware that life is actually not as constant as you think it's going to be. I mean, I was young, you didn't think about things like that. But this is no, in all seriousness, this is true. It's the only time I've ever had it happen, but I actually heard an audible voice that night from God telling me to say to my husband and my mum, tell them you're going to be all right. Now, if I say that I didn't know I wasn't all right, it wasn't that I was thinking, oh my goodness, I'm laying ill, and I didn't even know what I had. And I had no idea that that had happened until after I came out of hospital. So that suddenly I became aware again that life was incredibly unpredictable. And so this, if you like, the journey that I'd committed back when I was 8 was suddenly, and I'd had 2 quite, heart-stopping moments when you suddenly think, hey, this life that I think I've got in hand may not be quite as strong as I thought it was. But anyway, I was glad that God was still in control. It took me about 3 months to actually finally get well, but I did make a full recovery. So fast forward another couple of decades. I've got 2 daughters by then, and I discovered how great God was in being faithful again. I had a great church, great health, great friends, and 2 wonderful children. Life was good, and the open road, as I use this picture, was full of adventures. But then a decade came that was to shake me to the core, test my faith as never before, and where I felt that instead of God being in the driving seat, he'd parked the car, got out, thrown away the keys, and abandoned me. It felt too that everyone else I knew was in the fast lane. Often this happens, if we're going through a bad patch, you can see other people and they seem to be having such fun, fulfilling all their dreams, going past, and I felt stuck. Now, I think as any parent here listening would appreciate, we do have dreams for our children right from when they're born. And for me, the dreams for my younger daughter quite simply crumbled in my hands. At first, what seemed to be an incident that would pass became a growing nightmare. From being an inconvenient, annoying set of events, this stranger became a persistent stalker. Phone calls in the night, letters through the door, chance meetings escalated, and eventually the police were involved and a court order put in place. But this didn't stop the person, and the police acknowledged my daughter's life was in danger. Even when the stalker was eventually killed by a hit-and-run driver, and I need to say at this point, for which our cars were inspected in case we'd done it, and we hadn't, things spiraled out of control. Our once vibrant, funny, sporty daughter was diagnosed with ME and then PTSD. And the words from a doctor that echoed through my head were, and she may take years to recover, if then. To say I was afraid is an understatement. I was angry with God, and when I called out, there was silence. And I think we all come through life and we have experiences like that. The answers to my prayers for that situation were to take another 10 years in all. But I tell you what I did find in that time. Through the darkest days and the deepest valleys, God hadn't thrown away the keys or abandoned me. He was still in the driving seat, even though I had been an excellent backseat driver, and told him in no uncertain terms on many an occasion where he'd gone wrong and what he should have done. You see, even though that event I've just described was going on, I was still trying to keep my own day-to-day life going. And again, you've got this going on, that's a big deal, and you're still having to keep going. In my family and in my job. God sent friends to stand with us, to pray with us, and even give us encouraging words. Now, what really happened in amongst that, and Phil, your wife will remember, I became an ESOL teacher, and Rachel was amazing during that time. But it was all through that time of training as an ESOL teacher that I was having to face this thing with my daughter and just see her simply fold in. And it was at the beginning of January 2004. And I was simply at my wit's end. I'd cried buckets. I didn't know what I was to do next. I was finding the actual course, ESOL training, really hard. And I'd had some homework, an assignment, and this is it, because this brings me to the heart of what I've just been saying. What I had been told to do was I'd got to take a well-known game and make it into something that would become a learning of a particular set of words, vocabulary, English phrases for my foreign students. And I had chosen the game Snakes and Ladders. And because I hadn't got any snakes and ladders, I hadn't had them for years, and the girls were grown up and were over 20 by this time, I'd gone down to what was then Toys R Us, and I bought Snakes and Ladders. And I'd set it up on the table, and I was working out what I was going to do with this for my ESOL students. And all this time, I was very close to tears a lot of the time. So that evening, we used to have evening services at church. And I said my faith, I was clinging on, quite honestly, by my fingertips. I was feeling very raw and very cross, to say the least. And I'd gone that evening, and during the course of the church service, somebody had a picture, and they said they wanted to share what they felt God was saying for somebody or some people who were listening. And the picture that this person shared, they said, I've got a picture of a Snakes and Ladders board. And I see somebody who thinks their life has been a whole series of snakes. Now, do you know what I mean? You know, the game, you either go at the bottom of the ladder and you go up, or if you go to the snake's head, you roll down. And he said that person feels as if they've had a whole series of standing on the snake's head and then rolling down and almost going back to square one. I hardly knew how to breathe. I hadn't looked at a Snakes and Ladders board in decades. And yet here was this person who knew nothing, I can assure you, about my situation. I can remember going up to that person afterwards and said, that was me. And I just about managed to get out the words, and I feel my life is rubbish. And what it encouraged me that night, and it's a conversation that was had obviously, that actually that was a way of God saying, I know exactly how you're feeling. I know that you feel that you've gone down so many snakes, you can't go down much further. But I'm there. I know the upset. I know the fear. I know the anxiety. I know that you think your daughter will never get well. And it was, if you like, it was a reassurance, although I hadn't been able to palpably feel God, that he was there. Now, obviously, life is never plain sailing, but what I've told you, those two stories of the unsuddenlies of the car accident and of my illness, and then of feeling I was totally alone and God was so far away that where had he gone, and being reassured that he was there. Those three things have come back to me several times in the decades since. Just to complete the story on my daughter, it did take her 10 years. She's now really happily married, and she's got 4 lovely children, a wonderful husband. But I would say that what happened to her all those years ago still has, at times, quite significant impacts on her life. So it's not something that, oh, well, it was sorted, right, lovely, on to the next thing. But it taught me that God was there all the time, even when I thought he wasn't. And that has carried me through to what I've experienced in the last 2 years as mayor. So what does that mean? Well, and I can answer questions in between. Funnily enough, what I've learned through all of those years is I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow or even in an hour's time. And I've learned that more truly in the last 12, well, I think all of us have in the last 2 years, but personally as well. So I've learned over the years to see it as I'll never know whether I'm going to take the next step to whatever God's called me to. But I do know that every morning, if I say to him, Lord, you know where I'm going to go today. I might have things in the diary, but I've no idea exactly who I'm going to meet or who I'm going to talk to. You know, please make a difference. And I can tell you hundreds of stories. Now, let me give you just a little one. 4 years ago, it was through my work as a counsellor. I happened to be going down a road in my ward, and I knocked on a door. And who should come to the door but a couple I know who were parents of a girl I used to teach. And we instantly knew each other. They welcomed me in, as you could do then. And they said, oh, and I said, oh, how's their daughter? Oh, yeah, and they told me all about it. And I said, I still remember that class. In fact, it was almost one of the last classes I taught before I left there. And we always used to do a play. As a form teacher, we used to have to do something each term. And I committed, I said, well, Lord, I'm going to use those opportunities for you. Now, some of you may have come across the Riding Lights. It's a very old, it's an Anglican theatre group that really were around in about the 70s, 80s, that sort of time. But they've done some books, and I had little plays, and the girls used to turn them. They were such fun. And we did one. It was one of the last, and I'd done it deliberately because I knew they were leaving. They were going on to secondary school. So I thought, I'll use the story of Gideon. Those of you know the story of Gideon. If you don't, read the story. But it was very amusing. So I set all the characters, and their girls got excited and everything. And in a very amusing way, it tells the story of how Gideon was so frightened of anything he had to face. And every time God kept cutting the numbers, and he was left not with a 10,000 or 30,000 army. Then it went down to 10, then it went to 300. And God said, yeah, I think that's about right. 300 will suit. And he was terrified. And it goes through the story. And then at the end, in this particular play, it says this: however small you are, however insignificant you feel, the God of the universe can make your life dynamite. And right at the end of the year, I gave each girl a photograph of all of them dressed up in Gideon, with Gideon, and this at the bottom. And at the time, I just prayed, not with them, but I prayed that God would use these photographs. I mean, you know, when you're 11, you might keep a photograph, but hey ho, you know, you grow up, you go through your teens, you leave home, you get married. And in fact, some of those in that class have got kids of their own now. So I will tell you. Anyway, this particular set of parents, obviously the girl wasn't there. She was training to be, or had trained and had got qualified as a solicitor and was living in London. But we started talking about things, and suddenly the mum got up and she disappeared. I thought, where's she gone? And she went upstairs, came back down and said, I thought you might like to see this. And it was this photograph of the children in year 6 having performed Gideon. And if you can't get hold of this, Riding Lights, they are the funniest, loveliest, but most effective for children ever. And the adults, I mean, everybody used to say, oh, you're putting on one of those Riding Lights again. Fantastic. And they loved them. And that girl had that, that last little bit that I've just read out by her bed all those years. Now, I can't micromanage that, but I can say to God, whatever I do today, or whatever you want me to say, you're going to have to give me the words. I cannot do it myself. And that has been my mantra over time. And sometimes you never see the seeds you sow, but in other times, suddenly people will come back. Now, a more recent, and then I'll stop because I'd like some of you to ask questions because I might.
We have got a few coming up, so don't worry.
That's fine.
Just to say, Beryl, what I'm going to do, I'm going to let the when you
Just
finish your
write them
story.
in.
It's okay. When you finish your story now,
Yeah.
I'm going to sort of abandon the other question I had, which is fine. And
Yeah.
I think this is really important then to go to the questions from the audience.
Absolutely, Simon. I'll be guided by you.
Finish your story first, please. Go ahead.
So so you think, well, did that happen a long time ago? Well, yes. Right. Let me come and bring it very personally. So when I became deputy mayor that night, I would say that I was the most reluctant person. I was, as deputy mayor, you can continue on with your councillor interests and what they call a portfolio. But somehow I felt things were going to come hard. By this time, my husband had been diagnosed back in 2014, actually, and I'd never told, when I say I'd never told anybody, certainly not at the council, I had not told anyone. I did tell, obviously my family knew, my very, very close friends. And then when about 2017, 18, we let our church know, and they were really supportive. But I didn't want people, and I talked with Alan about this. We didn't want people to feel sorry for us or anything. I didn't know what the future held anyway. I know sometimes when people didn't know what he had, sometimes it would come up about Parkinson's in general, and they would say things that made my heart completely sink into my boots, but I didn't say anything. So that was the scenario. And a year later, I became mayor, and it was with quite a heavy heart. I knew that it was quite a lonely position. I didn't see my colleagues in quite the same way because you're not on any committees. But I thought, well, God, you've done this. So okay, I'm going to take each one and I'm really going to put everything into it. And it was a whirl of events, and we got to December 2019, which was the end of my, well, I became mayor in the May 2019, so this was in the December. And I posted up on one of my Facebook pages a New Year message. And it's one that I know some of you will know, and I'll just read it because, again, it becomes quite pertinent to what happens later. And I wrote these words. I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, give me a light that I can tread safely into the unknown. He replied, go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than a light and safer than a known way. So I went forth and, finding the hand of God, trod gladly into the night. Now I stood by those words. That was December 2019, as you know. March 2020, we went into lockdown. And that's when everything started to go pear-shaped at home. My husband got much worse. It was a whole series of things that I can't, it was awful. I couldn't get hold of anybody. Doctors were on Zoom or sometimes telephone calls, and I could do that. We had to change his medication, but he did begin to go downhill rapidly. And I thought, well, none of us expected COVID, but this was on top. It was our 50th wedding anniversary last August. And because we had planned to go abroad on holiday, but we decided, as we had to have a staycation. And he'd started to fall a lot. But for the 2 weeks before we went on holiday, the 3 weeks we were away, and the 2 weeks afterwards, he didn't fall at all. We've got some fabulous photographs of him smiling, loving it. We went back to family haunts that we'd known as, the girls had known as children, and we hadn't visited for years. It was absolutely wonderful. But then the falls started to come again, and in October he was admitted to hospital. And he was due to come out. They wanted to send him to physio at Walton Hospital and stay there and then come home. But one Friday morning, I was phoned and told that he'd caught COVID. All I said was, how on earth has that happened? And she said, I don't know. And Alan, from that day, lasted 22 days. For 1 week, we were able to communicate. We couldn't see him, but he was able to communicate and phone with his mobile, or I was able to use one of their phones that the staff gave. But the last 2 weeks, he just couldn't communicate. And so for those last 2 weeks, we had no idea what was happening. And if you think that what I said in my message on the mayor thing in 2019, I said to the man, give me a light that I can know what's happening. And it's figuratively, but the man said, actually, you need to put your hand into the hand of God. He'll take you through. He'll lead you through. He'll lead you through the best and the worst of times. And I had proved that from things, as I say, that had happened a long time in the past. And he finally passed away on the 28th of November. I still put that same post up this last December in 2020 as we went into the new year. It was a gruesome year in terms of Christmas, as we all know. Lots of people were on their own. I was on my own. We had Zoom for family. It was not what I wanted. But I have to say, when the chips are down, I did know God's guiding. So all that time ago, when I was 8, I made a commitment then. And there've been twists and turns. There've been the unsuddenlies of life. In a way, this was an unsuddenly that had happened. It wasn't what was in my dream. It wasn't what was in my heart. It wasn't what had been in my prayers. But I did know, and perhaps the good thing to come out of it, and I'll just finish with this because this brings me more or less up to date, although there's just one more story. When Alan passed away, God had given me some words that he said, I want you to put this on your mayor's Facebook page. And it honestly, when I put this down on paper, it was an email which I sent across to our church leader, and I just said, can you just look through it? I don't want to post anything that you don't think is. And this is what I wrote. And I want you to remember, you know, the seeds of that little girl, you know, with the photograph of Gideon, and she had it all those years later. Well, this is something that has had a profound effect. So I wrote this. Over my last 18 months as Mayor of Woking, it's been a pleasure to share in many varied and wonderful events. All the way through the COVID crisis, despite the lockdowns and restrictions, there has been so much to celebrate and be thankful for as the borough, the faith communities and many charity groups have worked together to make the lives of our residents so much better through their caring and sharing. I've seen much of this at first hand through being part of Welcome Church here in Woking. I'd like to tell you about one person in particular, my husband, Alan. Through all this time, Alan has been there each step of the way. He's supported me, been my greatest champion and the wisest and kindest partner anyone could ask for. We've so many great chapters in our 50 years of marriage, and it's been so much fun. Sadly, last Saturday, the 28th of November, I wrote this on the 1st of December, so just 3 days later, he passed away in a COVID ward at St. Peter's Hospital, having been there for the last 5 weeks. I'd not been able to visit, and then the last 2 weeks, he was too weak to communicate with the family or me. In his last phone call, he asked if I was being cared for and if the grandchildren were fine, which was so typical of someone who always thought of others first. It's an incredibly sad time for me and the family, yet we have many happy and funny memories. Alan was a kind, gentle and caring man, and for many years was a pastor at Welcome Church. Although his final chapter here has now ended, and this is the important bit, I do not believe that it's the end of the story. As committed Christians, Alan and I always shared a confidence, and do, that death is not the end. He's now beginning a new chapter with his Heavenly Father, free from the disease that took away so much of who he really was, and which was compounded by COVID at the end. Whatever our circumstances, Christmas is going to be a very different time for all of us this year. The tiered restrictions will separate families, and there will be empty seats at dinner tables across this town, as there will be at my own. My next chapter will also now begin and will be very different. Facing 2021, I have a hope and I have a future as I put my trust and hand into God's hands, who sent his only son Jesus into the world, as we remember and celebrate at Christmas time. We can trust him to lead us into the unknown and to care for us whatever lies ahead. And then I say, I do hope you have a merry and safe Christmas and a happy new year. So if you like, that encapsulated the faith I put in God all those years ago, that's had its twists and turns. It's not a life that's been a life of, as any of us have. I'm not saying I'm any different, but what it does say is that whatever, and we don't know what's happening this year, we are hoping for good times, and I'm sure we will have some, but none of us saw COVID coming, and yet I know that through it all, God has kept me. Just one thing to finish, and then I will be quiet. And that is, I said to you right at the beginning, I found it that my faith is like an adventure. So every morning I wake up and I say, God, today it's an adventure. Please take me where you want me. Last Friday was one such time. I had a mission. I had some things to pop into people's houses. And my daughter was doing it one side, I was doing it the other. And suddenly up in front of me was a man tending his front garden. It was a beautiful day last Friday, and I just said, hello, how are you? Just want to pop something through. And he stopped and he said some really quite nice things, but this was the point. We suddenly got talking. And to this day, I don't know what we were talking about, because I found him saying to me, oh, I've got, and I hadn't said anything about Alan. Oh, I've got Parkinson's. And by that time, his wife had come from the back. She must have heard me talking to him. And I looked at him and I said, I have got to say, you look amazing. And I said, I'm not just saying that because I know how some do look. He looked amazing. And she said, there you are, dear. She said, so many people in your family, and I keep on saying, you look really good. And I said, and you've got such a lovely smile. And that's one of the things that sometimes, and Alan always kept his smile. And I just told him about the story. There was a connection because he had it and he looked so sad. And I just told him a little bit about Alan and about, he always had his smile and that Alan had a faith and so on. It's just that little chance. It was just a chance. I hadn't planned it. I didn't know I was going to meet him. And yet it was what I would call, I know some of you would know and hear this expression, so it's not my expression, a divine appointment. It was God knew who I was going to meet that day or what conversations I was going to share. And so it takes away the angst of me saying, what am I going to do for God today? You don't have to do that. It's just living your life, saying, God, take away all the bits that aren't good. Please work your love for people through my life. And I know a lot of you would identify with that. So that's where I am. I'm happy to answer questions. That basically just gives you a flavour.
Thank you, Beryl. That's more than a flavour, I think. And I saw some of the comments as you were speaking, words such as inspirational and amazing. And really, I think your life is inspirational. And I didn't know anything about your husband. I hadn't heard anything in the news, obviously. So, you know, obviously my condolences. But as you said, he's in a different level now, a different plane. And I think there are many people perhaps watching tonight who would also agree with that death is not an end. It's just moving into a different sort of life. But I know that Phil has been waiting there very patiently to ask a question. Phil, I believe you're going to start us off with some of the questions.
Well, there are a number of questions. Simon hasn't had a chance to look at them, so I'm going to just...
That's fine. Fire away.
You've got Kerry saying, I think Beryl should become a preacher once her term ends. So inspirational. I think you already are. But Constantino has said, it's interesting that in all the downs that you still stuck with your faith, Beryl. Yeah. Is there a time, there's a question, let's get the question first, please. Is there a time when you directed any possible anger you may have had on God, questioned your faith, why me perhaps? Interesting, especially as perhaps for some in similar circumstances, they may have abandoned God or religion altogether. So any response to that sense where
I think
pain and suffering makes people leave?
It does, but the closest, as I said, that I ever got to that was when I saw my daughter. My daughter, if I can just describe her, she's one of the most effervescent, funny. At school, she became deputy head girl. She was athletic. The whole thing, and I saw her life just crumble, and in a huge way. She couldn't work for 3 years. She was, when she got up in the morning, it looked as if she hadn't slept in months. There was a real sadness. And I think, for me anyway, I cried more during those years than I can and wish to remember, really. And yeah, I was really angry. And what compounded it was I had left. I felt God had said you were to leave. I was to leave my job. So it was a job I'd loved, and I took early retirement. And I did this ESOL course, which I found probably the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life. And I have said this to Rachel, but I tell you, that department stood by me. But what I was given, and remember, this was so hurting inside, what was happening to my daughter, that the one class I was given that I remember, every Monday morning I had to be in Shearwater at 9:30. And I thought, God, what are you doing? I'm hating this. Where are you? Now, this was in early 2004, and I just felt I didn't hear anything. And I was really angry. Now, why did my faith keep going? Well, I would say my faith was minimal at that time. I don't think I prayed. I don't think I did anything. But I did have, and I think this is important, when you're going through those tough times, I think you need people who have got faith, who have got faith for your story, or who say, and I can, in fact, I was with her today, or who can say, we know how you're hurting, and we will. They came every Sunday afternoon and would pray with us. And I would spend more time crying than anything else. I didn't have an awful lot to say. And the other thing was, I found that when I went to church, all I did was sob. It was like a bereavement. And I felt angry all that time. And what makes it worse, and for anybody who might have gone through this, or maybe going through it, the worst thing you can do is to look at other people and think it's all very well for X and Y and Z. And I used to do that all the time. But actually, that doesn't help you. And everybody treads a path that at some stage takes you through that valley of the shadow, as we call it. And it took me a long time for my heart to respond to God. But that picture that I had was given about the snakes and ladders, I remember really crying at that point. But it was God, if you like, and I'm using earthly images here, sending me a telegram saying, I am still there. And by the way, I haven't lost control of that steering wheel. You might think I have, but hang in there. And you know, I'm so glad I did. So that when the unexpected or the unsuddenlies of life happened again last year for me, I really embraced the knowledge that God was there. And I know he was there. I couldn't have gone through anything that I've gone over the last. And do you know what it's done? It's made me far more sympathetic to people I meet who maybe haven't got a faith and have gone through even worse times. And you think, how do they manage it? And it gives you a compassion that is only something that God gives. So sometimes through our own difficulties, disappointments, sadness, bereavement, illnesses, cancer diagnoses, whatever it is, suddenly you begin to see there's a hurting world out there who has no hope. And for me, it's sort of saying, there is a hope. It may not feel like it, but there is a hope. I've learned that in my life, and it's pushing through. It's not that you can't do it, but it's just saying, God, I don't know where you are, but I know you're there. Please help me.
Beryl, I was reading through some of the questions here, and one basically said, have all the misfortunes in life made you stronger? What you're saying, it has made you stronger. But then that leads on then to Zarina's question, which is, what are some of the community impacts or differences that you have made, and she says, made with God, that you are most proud of in Woking?
Okay, do you know the one time that I've had the most incredible time? And this is where I come back to Phil again. So this is a good news story, Phil, for Rachel. Those times that I most dreaded going into an ESOL class was some of the loveliest, and my heart just went out to these ladies. It was the most amazing love for these people who were, you know, many of them going through the same things that any of the rest of us were doing. I didn't know anything about the Muslim community, but just teaching them, befriending them, getting to know them. We still exchange. I exchange Eid cards with them. They do with Christmas cards with me. That's 14 years. There's some of them still live in Shearwater. Some of the deepest friends I've had and keep are the ones I made in that community. And just sharing. You know, one lady, her father died. Now, I had no idea what they do in the Muslim community. I just took her some flowers. Do you see what I mean? It's as simple as compassionate as that. And it meant everything, probably more than if I'd sent a bunch of flowers to a neighbor next door or whatever. And just learning, sharing meals together. And it just gives you a heart for people who are lonely. I mean, I felt lonely over certain times over this, as all of us, I'm sure, have, but certainly since I've been mayor, it's quite a lonely position, believe it or not. I mean, you do lots of openings and things and meet amazing people, but because Alan couldn't come to any of them, that's what made it lonely. But it's just saying, it's just giving people a love that maybe they haven't experienced, or they're lonely, or they're perhaps inside their houses and don't go out much. And it's just that sharing of life together that is part of what I think we are, well, first of all, as human beings, but I think for me, there's a Christian element of just saying, you know, a glass of water with somebody, or this is what Jesus said himself. If you do this for this person and this for, that's doing it as if you're doing it to me. And some of my best friends at the moment are people I've known for the last 4 or 5 years. An amazing story of how I met them, a Syrian family. And we've shared all sorts of things together. So it's that.
Yeah, I've just noticed that, sorry to stop you there for a second, I just noticed that about 8 minutes ago, Phil was left a message saying we had about 10 minutes, now we're down to about a minute.
That's fine, Simon.
Which I think is right, Phil.
Yep, you're right.
So perhaps I could maybe just draw things. I'm sorry we didn't have time to go in detail through all the questions, and they were wonderful questions and wonderful points were made. Beryl, thank you so much for coming along tonight and for sharing your life with us, and your highs, your lows, the impact of God. And it has been a wonderful story. I think we've all learned a lot, not only about you, but maybe also about ourselves and about each other. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about these sort of the talks. We actually really learn about each other, and we break down those barriers between us, because we are all human beings.
Absolutely. So
thank you so much. God bless you for coming along tonight and talking to us all tonight. And thank you to our wonderful audience, the wonderful questions and points you put in the questions as well. And Phil, thank you so much for hosting. It's been much appreciated. So
and if you all look at the bottom right of your screen, there's reactions, and there's a little hand clap you can do like this.
That's right, like that. Some of you might.
Or even you can even throw a little thumbs up or a smiley
I love using those.
or even a party. So thank you ever so much. We will announce the next one of these once we've finalized the arrangements, but hopefully in 3 or 4 weeks we'll be able to do another one. And
it's lovely to see everybody. Have a lovely evening.
Yeah,
take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very much.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil.
It's a pleasure.
And I shall see you soon. Thank you, Serena. Thank you, Hilary. Take care.
Willing. Yeah.
Thanks to Constantino.
Thank you for all your questions, Constantino.
Yes, it was lovely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Eureka, the light is shining upon you above your head.
Yes.
Phil, I've unmuted myself.
Oh, that's all right.
I wanted to put something on the chat, which I've done, but I didn't know how to do any further with it.
Okay. What did you put in the chat?
I put footprints comes to mind.
Oh yes, indeed.
Ah, yes.
Yeah,
Um,
about being lifted
but-
in those.
But I
moments.
printed it, I've typed it, but I didn't dare do anything further because I know what I'm capable
All
of.
you need to do, Hilary, is you hit the enter button. That's the one that
Oh,
either
it's
says
not, no,
enter.
it came through.
Oh, it
It's
came
there.
through. Okay, there you
Oh,
go.
yeah.
Yeah, if you hit the enter button, it comes through straight away.
Well, I think, Hilary, you can do a blog on that for our Facebook group, for our weekly thought for the day, you know, thought for the week.
Yeah,
Do something
absolutely.
on footprints. That'd be great.
Lovely.
And Farah has put love for all, hatred for none.org. Thank you, Farah. God bless everyone. I'm going to
Good
close.
night, Mary, as well. Nice to see you too. I can
Nice
see you
to
on the
see
corner
you,
of my
Mary.
screen there.
Again, I keep on bumping into you, Mary. We'll have to stop
you.
meeting like this.
Thanks, Red. Good
Bye,
night now,
everyone.
Phil. Thank you, everybody. Good night.